morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. How has the war in Ukraine changed Europe? With Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden and also co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, moderated by Jim Thomson, a professor at the Pardee Rand Graduate School, and he is also the President Emeritus of the Rand Corporation. For those of you who would like to ask the Prime Minister and Jim questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Simply type in your questions and we'll get to those in about 35 minutes. So Jim, it's time to bring you on to moderate the program with the Prime Minister Bildt. We can't wait for this discussion. Thank you so much for making this happen, Jim.
A little dwell time problem there. Anyways, I'm on. So I want to welcome everybody here and also want to welcome virtually to Los Angeles, Carl Bildt from Sweden, where it's now after 8. So welcome, Carl. Carl, we advertised this as Carl is the former Prime Minister of Sweden, which is true. He did, but that's almost 30 years ago. He was 91 to 94 Prime Minister of Sweden. And you can look at him and guess he was a very young man to do that. After that, he was under different titles. He had the role of the representative of the European Union to the Balkan conflict, including a period of time where he was called the High Representative. That was from 95 to 2001. I guess some of that was a part-time job, but he was the co-chair of the Dayton Peace Conference, along with the other co-chair was Dick Holbrooke. And after he became the foreign minister of Sweden in 2006, which he did for 8 years. And as Kim mentioned, he's now the chairman of the European Council on Foreign Relations, but more importantly, he's a trustee of the Rand Corporation, which is not how I know him, but it's one of the ways. I mean, I knew him beforehand. I recruited him to be a trustee. So, Carl, it's really great to have you here virtually in Los Angeles. I wonder if you might just start by how did you come to land into these jobs?
Well, that's a good question. I was in the politics of Sweden, of course, since student days. You might say that I was dragged into student politics, or dragged into politics in the wake of the radical wave of the late 1960s. So in the early 1970s, I entered politics. I was still at university. In 1976, we had a change of government. I was recruited to be sort of a fairly central position, coordinating policies in that particular government. Then I entered parliament and I became party leader, and then I became prime minister. And my prime ministerial period was the early 90s, as you pointed out, when everything was up for flux in Europe. The Berlin Wall was down, the Soviet Union disappeared. 2 months after I became prime minister, we had all of the questions of the reunification of Germany, of the withdrawal of Soviet ex-Russian or ex-Soviet Russian forces from the Baltic states. I became fairly heavily involved in European security and global security affairs. And then when I ended up become prime minister, that's when they, for that reason, I guess, recruited me to different assignments in the Balkan conflicts for X numbers of years, and the rest is history.
And during the period of when you were prime minister, it was a period of considerable economic reform, which was pushed through by the government. Might say a word about that.
Yeah, it was. It was also a period of economic crisis. But I mean, we've been sort of gradually, we'd had mounting economic difficulties in Sweden during the last sort of 10, 15 years. And for a number of political reasons, nothing really had been done. And that meant that when there was a general financial crisis in Europe during those years, we were fairly badly hit. Now, we went to the government with a fairly radical reform program. And we managed, as a matter of fact, to get that reform program through, in spite of the fact that the economy was going rapidly downhill. We turned the economy around. And a lot of those reforms, controversial at the time, have stayed and have meant that Sweden, during the subsequent sort of the following 20 years, had a very good economic development. And so it was overall successful. It coincided, of course, and that was another key item on my agenda at that time, of us entering the European Union as full members. We'd been outside up until then.
Great, thanks for that little bit about that. But let's turn now to the issues of the day. We advertised this as a discussion of Europe after the invasion of Ukraine, but I think we are, given that we have Carl here, who's involved really globally and has recently been other places which we might talk about as well. But let's start with Ukraine war and Europe, and I'm particularly what I would say the unity of Europe after the invasion. I think many people, and I probably including me, thought that this would really strain Europe to respond to the invasion because of the differential interests across the continent in the situation. And those exist, and I think that it would be good if we talked about some of those differential interests. But the European Union and the rest of Europe, in fact, has really stuck together. And I think it might be good to talk about, why has it done so well, and then where are the fissures that we have to worry about?
Well, I mean, you're entirely right to say that you were surprised by the unity that you demonstrated. I can say that so was I, because going back to my years as foreign minister, sitting in, I think I had roughly 100 meetings of the Council of Ministers of the European ministers, and Russia was a divisive issue, no question about that. There were different attitudes to it, and that had to do with history and geography and a couple of other factors. But when the Russians, Putin to be precise, did what he did, that virtually overnight disappeared. And there's been sort of a remarkable unity in the European Union, with measures taken that were unthinkable in every single respect prior to that. And add to that, of course, we've had a remarkable unity across the Atlantic Ocean when it comes to primarily sanctions policy, but also the policy of supporting Ukraine. Will this hold up? In ECFR, European Council of Foreign Relations, we did a major opinion survey, I think it was a month ago by now. And the answer coming out of that is yes. As a matter of fact, and we were slightly surprised by that, support for Ukraine and support for a strong line on Ukraine had, as a matter of fact, gone up since we did the last survey of that sort 6 months ago. I mean, that could be sort of statistical things, but the overall message is very strong support for helping Ukraine. We Europeans see what Putin has done as a threat, needless to say, to Ukraine. He wants to get rid of Ukraine, but as a threat to the overall structure of European security and to a very large extent global security. And that is why the importance of that issue has become so obvious to the electorates all over Europe, really.
But there are some political differences, and it might be worth talking a bit about those. The countries, not surprisingly, the countries which are in the former Eastern Europe that are closest to Ukraine and Russia have a much firmer position and are less willing to talk about settlements than, let's say, France, particularly the president of France, Macron, who has several times, bruited the possibility that maybe we could find a settlement. I think The Economist a couple of weeks ago said that he wants to be sure that there's a European seat at the table when there's a peace conference, and he also wants to be, and everybody else in Europe wants to be sure it's not him. But meanwhile in France there's a lot of political issues now. Do you think that his position to take sort of a somewhat differentiated position on Ukraine is going to be able to hold up in light of his own political difficulties?
I'm not quite certain that the domestic difficulties that are fairly substantial, we can return to those. I don't think that will affect very much his foreign policy. I mean, he's on his last term as president of France. The president of France has an extremely strong position constitutionally on foreign affairs. It's like the president of the United States, even stronger to some extent. So I don't think that will sort of change that much. He has been, has to be said, by French standards, very robust on the issue. He had an experience what might have been an important one in the sort of run up to the conflict, and also in the days immediately after the beginning of the conflict. He had a number of telephone calls with Putin, trying to see if he could sort of negotiate something or prevent the outbreak of the war, close down the war very, very, very early. He was very firmly rebuffed by Putin. And I think he learned a rather bitter lesson from that. And we haven't seen any further attempts by him for a very long time. I think he's keen to keep a channel of communication open with Putin. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a telephone call now and then, but it's been a fairly long time since there was any direct communication between Paris and Moscow.
And it appears that the other European countries have been fairly firm on the idea that this is not the time for a peace settlement, because we have, if we have a ceasefire, it's going to concede a lot of territory to Russia. This seems to be holding fairly firm. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think you are right about that. I mean, the line is, and I think that's the same line in Washington, by the way, is that sort of we are there to support the Ukraine. We are, needless to say, in favor of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, because if that were to be endangered, it could be, in the sort of prolongation of the entire thing, endanger the territorial integrity and sovereignty of other European countries, notably those in the east of Europe. So our line is we support the government in Kiev, President Zelensky, and what there are aims that he has, as long as it's those aims, we support them. And then it's up to him to make the judgment if there were to be a need for political talks or some political compromise. I don't see that at the moment. And I don't see it primarily for the reason I don't see any willingness in Moscow from President Putin's side to engage in any talks at this time. You saw that the Chinese have been trying to move him in direction of talks, but not really with any major success.
Yeah, I'll just make an observation that one of the criticisms of the U.S. policy not from this kind of Putin, not from the Putin lovers or what, the Putin verstehers in the U.S., it's been that we're putting by taking the position that it's up to Ukraine, we're basically basing our policy a slave to Ukraine, and we shouldn't be doing that. But that's about, among the criticism among the people who support the war in Ukraine, that would be the principal one. Let's turn to energy a little bit here. I think another great surprise, even greater surprise actually, has been the success of the European energy policy. And I mean, the price of gas is now back down to, I think, pre-war levels. Maybe it's up a little bit again, but the gas crisis has been, being an analyst, I always look at the daily temperature in Berlin for the last 5 or 6 months, and it was interesting to see that the beginning of the winter, Berlin was fairly warm, but it went back, it regressed to the mean. It went back to pretty cold place. So I mean, maybe it's warmer now, but it's the end of March. But what do you think is what made the difference in this year that made it possible to get through this winter? And then do you think we're in a good position for 2024?
Well, we certainly did better than many expected, because what happened is that while prior to the war, 40% of the imported gas, natural gas to Europe, to the European Union, was coming from Russia. And that all disappeared, virtually all disappeared. I think it's 5, 6, 7% that is still there to the Hungarians and a couple of others, but it's very marginal quantities. Primarily the German economy, which is the biggest economy of the EU, was very dependent on. I mean, it's a very strong effort. Prices did help in the sense that higher prices means that people save. There were other efforts to save. There was very strong attempts successful ones, to build not only one, but 2 LNG terminals. import LNG at fairly high prices, has to be said, on the world market, but overall it succeeded. We were lucky also in the sense that the storage facilities were fairly filled up with Russian gas to a large extent since previous days. And that's the question mark now as we approach next winter. We will not be able, those countries that are affected will not be able to fill up the storage with new deliveries of Russian gas. It has to be filled up from other sources. I think that will be possible, but there might be sort of new strain on prices as we enter next winter. But the fear of a big crisis, I think that was managed, and I think that's gone.
You mentioned the next winter, though, with the fact that the storage will likely be drawn down substantially. You mentioned also LNG, and I think that's maybe we'll see. I think we will see more LNG terminals being built around Germany. Some of them I think are floating, but I think that, and there's also a lot of LNG that comes into Spain, and there's a question of pipeline, though, whether they could get it from Spain to Germany, but. Anyways, that's, yeah.
You have pipeline from Algeria and Libya coming into Italy. I mean, a lot of that, I mean, all of that will be augmented. Nothing of that will be radical in itself, but it will add up to a situation which, I mean, I'm fairly confident will be manageable next winter as well.
I want to turn, Carl, to the politics in Germany.
No.
Because right after the invasion, Chancellor Scholz made this statement about which is this we have arrived at a Zeitenwende, a turning point, and that's been interpreted as though it meant a policy change. But how much has policy in Germany really changed, especially when it comes to, we'll come to this more a little bit later, but also with respect to defense and foreign policy?
I think it has changed fairly fundamentally. I mean, and it's been interesting to watch to follow the German debate that has been there, because in Germany, of course, the relationship with Russia, with the Soviet Union, has been a special one. I mean, there are a couple of factors that we should be aware of. One is, of course, the Second World War, which was savage, to put say the least, concerning what the Germans did to the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, by the way, to the Soviet Union. And there's an element of sort of bad guilt over that, needless to say, and an element of care over that part of the history. The second part of the history, which was important, was that there were very many Germans who said, well, Soviet Union is a bad thing, but Gorbachev gave us German reunification. We should not forget that there were 500,000 Russian soldiers in the east of Germany, in the very heart of Europe, preventing Germany from achieving the reunification for a generation. And suddenly Gorbachev said, okay, I withdraw my forces from Germany, I give you your country back, and I do all of that. So those factors have been fairly important for the Germans, and meant that the Germans have been more careful than others in managing their relationship to Russia. Add to that the gas issues and other issues, but that's a separate issue. So there's been a fairly turbulent debate in Germany. Was our Russia policy wrong from the beginning? And whether the answer is yes or whether the answer is no, I mean, it's been sort of, the consensus seems to be, yes, we were wrong. We know how to fundamentally reassess. Even the president of Germany, who is highly respected, he was foreign minister during that period, has made a sort of a speech as a president, re-evaluating the entire policy that was pursued by Germany towards Russia during the last, say, 10, 15 years. And that's quite remarkable debate with the thoroughness that you can find in a German debate. So the change has been there. There have been some remnants inside the Social Democratic Party. And of course, you have sort of the extreme left and the extreme right, but they are marginal. But overall, no question, the policy has changed.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize that point about the German president making a speech about this. That's a big deal. So, well, let's turn to defense, and let's start with the Germans, because I mean, my personal view is that, you know, the NATO goal, which has been in place now for almost 10 years, of 2% of GDP was never going to be enough for the post-invasion situation in Europe. I mean, if Europe is really going to do a lot more, they can't get by on 2%. It's important to remember that during the Cold War, of course, we had the situation that you're describing with the group of Soviet forces in the heart of Germany, 20 divisions, only in that force by itself, that were a big threat. But so it's not quite the same, but still, in those days, the U.S. was spending 4 to 5% GDP on defense, and most European countries were well above 3%. So, I mean, we have a long way to go, and the Germans in particular would, had not only the effect of reduced spending, but the reduced spending had consequences that the German armed forces were basically broken. They couldn't fly airplanes, and they can't drive. And so I haven't yet seen, I mean, Schultz talked about $100 million to go to the armed forces, but I don't see that happening yet. And I just wonder if you have a different view of what's going on with respect to German armed forces and with others.
Yeah. No, it is happening. I mean, Germany is heading to 2%. It will take a couple of years. That is the same with all of the other countries virtually in Europe who've been below 2%. I mean, take the Nordic countries where sort of down to 1 to 1.5, or all up to 2. The Poles are going to be aiming for 3%, by the way, which is quite a lot of money. Germany going for 2%, which is a hell of a lot of money, taking into consideration the size of the German economy. But you are right in pointing out that their forces had been run down. So it's going to take quite some time to get them up to the training standards and other standards that are necessary. But there's no question that it will happen. Even the UK is discussing whether they should go to 2.2, for example. The French are discussing the same. So where we end up sort of 5 or 10 years from now, more likely somewhat above 2%, more likely to be above 2% than below 2%. And then the strength of the forces is, of course, going to be highly dependent upon the level of integration between them and the ability to, because now we are relying on the United States for some core capabilities, whether we can replace those or have in parallel. Those are big issues for the future. But for the moment, of course, the Russians are otherwise occupied, you can say. If I look at from the Swedish point of view, if I look at the Russian forces that used to be fairly close to us, close to Norway, close to the Finnish border in Kaliningrad, they are virtually gone. Smashed. They were sent to Ukraine and they were smashed to pieces. It's going to take quite some time for them to come back. So the emphasis now is on supporting Ukraine with training, with armament, with equipment, US doing a lot, Europe doing somewhat more on the financial side. The emphasis is on there, and then the build up to defense, somewhat more medium term, is happening.
Well, you mentioned the Nordics and Sweden. I wanted to ask you about Sweden and NATO. We're waiting, of course, we're dealing with this Turkish problem, and maybe you can say something about that. But I'm kind of interested in the roots of this, because for my now I have to say how many years of dealing with NATO, that was always off the table, or appeared to be off the table. And then suddenly, I would have to say, out of the blue, with like the Zeitenwende, this change in Sweden and Finland, but especially since you were a former prime minister and foreign minister, the change in Sweden, were there precursors to all of this, and this was just waiting to happen, or what?
I think that if you look at what sort of the situation prior to this particular war and what Putin did, we were on a glide path towards NATO membership, because there was an integration one step after that. Did I expect to happen? I did expect it to happen within sort of 5 or 10 years, but something of that order. It was going to happen. We were on the way. But of course, 24th of February, primarily the Finns woke up that morning and said, this is 1939 again, the Winter War. So Finland turned around extremely fast because they have long border with Russia that they saw suddenly going back on a military expansion of a major nature. So for them, it wasn't a discussion. Sweden somewhat took a couple of more months because the NATO issue had been sort of controversial. Our Social Democratic Party had been dead against for a very long time, partly sort of ideological, partly domestic politics. But of course, with Finland doing its change, Sweden had to do the same. I mean, Sweden and Finland are very close. We are close politically. We are close sort of human. And of course, in terms of territory and security policy. So we ended up amazingly fast with the decision to apply jointly on the same day for NATO membership. I can't remember the day, but we are sort of mid-May or something like that, which was a remarkable fast turnaround on a very big issue. Then we are now waiting, as you pointed out, the ratification. I think Hungary ratified Finland today, earlier. They will do Finland. Turkey will do Finland as well. Sweden, we have a problem with Mr. Erdogan with some issues, and he has an election campaign. So I would expect that to happen after the Turkish election.
About 3 months away, right? Something like that.
Yeah. I mean, the first round of elections is May 14th.
Okay.
And then they're likely to be a second round 2 weeks down the line, but we'll see. And it's both presidential and parliamentary elections, so it could well be a rather messy political situation in Turkey. We just have to wait and see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I want to take it before I run out of time here. I want to take advantage of your recent travels and the fact that we'll move a little bit beyond Europe. You've been in Israel. And I mean, this is the situation in Israel to me, another remarkable situation, a huge outpouring of people on the streets. And apparently the back down by Netanyahu to pause his efforts to change the nature of the Supreme Court. I think there'll be people saying, is this a strategic pause? Does he intend to come back again after things calm down? Or is the whole effort by Netanyahu to change the nature of the Supreme Court to completely dead? I wonder what you think about that, but also what you think about the background of this whole issue.
Yeah, I mean, first, I think it's a tactic, of course. I think you understood that the sort of consequences of going forward this week could have been rather severe. So he now said that he's going to take up the issue at the next, when the Knesset reconvenes in May. And I see that President Herzog is trying to see if he can mediate something. But I returned from both Israel and Palestine deeply worried. We have the crisis in Israel, which is to a certain extent long-term, because this is a reflection of changes that have occurred in Israeli society. We have the right of the ultra-Orthodox, extremely religious, extremely nationalistic right, and they are sort of demanding changes, both in terms of the legal structure and attitude to settlements and to the Palestinians. So that's a crisis bound to come, the one way or the other. Then we have a crisis on the Palestinian side with the legitimacy of the entire sort of effort to create a two-state solution and Palestinian Authority and all of that. They haven't had elections since 2006. The legitimacy of President Abbas is non-existent. He's 86 years or something like that. So transition will have to come there, and God knows what's going to happen. And then we have an increase in tension between the two of them. We had more than 100 people being killed in sort of terrorist attacks and Israeli raids and pogroms against the Palestinians and things like that in the last few months. So tension is building up inside Israel, in the Palestinian areas, and between the Palestinian areas and Israel. So it's really sort of a recipe for rather dangerous situation for further down the line.
And we add to that picture the Iran situation
Yeah.
with respect to the nuclear weapons, and that I don't know where that stands. It looks to be completely dead, but every now and then it comes back to life. That there may be a return of Iran to the JCPOA, the agreement. But some have speculated that Netanyahu will take advantage of this period if in fact the Iranians continue to move down the path. They're only weeks away from having a tested nuclear weapon. So it might be an effort by the Israelis to take it out militarily. And I wonder what you think about that. What you also think about the situation with the JCPOA.
Well, I think the JCPOA is sort of dead for the moment anyhow. Whether there will be any attempts to do any sort of temporary fix in order to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control, yeah, I think there will be such attempt. I don't see them at the moment, but I would expect that to happen because no one has an interest in a complete collapse of that particular process because we don't know what will come out of that. Will the Israelis do a military strike? I doubt it. I think one interesting sign, US policy is important. The Israelis have ordered, I can't remember the number, but I think between 6 or 8 big tankers, I mean aircraft for tanking, which they need for long range strike, and US hasn't delivered them. I mean, there's a message there. And without those tankers, I don't think the Israelis can do any significant strike on their own. They require a green light from DC, which I think is somewhat unlikely. The surprising development in the last few weeks, of course, very surprising, caught everyone by surprise, is that the Israelis were very much hoping to normalize relationship with Saudi Arabia, following the Abraham's Accord and relationship with other Gulf states. What happened instead was that the Saudis normalized with Iran and concluded with Chinese mediation, an agreement that goes well beyond just diplomatic relations. And the key policymaking from Iran has subsequently been in Oman, it's been in the Emirates, it's been in Iraq. So it's quite a remarkable display of Chinese diplomacy that has led to a rather significant reordering of things in the region, which has come as a very, very cold shower to primarily Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And also to the US.
To the US to some extent. I mean, because the US went out, I mean, the US is clearly uncomfortable with the fact that it was done by the Chinese, needless to say. But I noticed a statement by the State Department who said that was an essentially good thing, which is correct. We don't have an interest in armed conflict in the region. We have an interest in them talking to each other. But the fact that it was done in the way it was done was, of course, slightly uncomfortable from the US point of view.
Well, we're about to close from my part. We'll get to our audience in just a sec. But one more part of your recent travels was to India. And of course, yes, it was only yesterday or the day before that we saw that Rahul Gandhi has been barred from being in the whatever they call their Congress. I mean, they call it Congress, and that's just one of the latest steps by India away from democracy. And I just wonder what your impression is of the situation in India.
But I wouldn't call it away from democracy. It's still a fairly vibrant democracy, and it's the world's largest. I mean, roughly half of all people in the world who live in democracies live in India. But there are tendencies in the Modi governance that are sort of uncomfortable, and this is a sign of that. There have been a number of others such. When he was BBC, for example, did a program which was highly critical of his performance in Gujarat during riots that resulted in a large number of Muslims being killed, and that caused a reaction, and they raided the offices of the BBC and things like that. So we have to be, I think, fairly clear in our messages to Prime Minister Modi at the same time as he is doing impressive things with the domestic reform agenda, with the economic development, with a couple of other things, digital development, to some extent with foreign policy as well, although there are some question marks there as well. So It's still a democracy, no question about that, but there are question marks, significant question marks.
Very good. Well, I mean, I've got a few more, but you're very concise. So to say that, I think that people, our audience probably doesn't realize you do once a week. You do Europe in 60 seconds on, I don't know, it's run on Twitter or what particular. And you answer 2 questions about Europe in 60 seconds. And I was a little worried about that today, but you've had more than that. So let's Rachel, let's go to the audience and see what kind of questions we have.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being here today. And we have a lot of great questions from our audience. So you just spoke about China's role in the recent deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So this audience member was wondering, what is Europe's current view on the China challenge, including being a good faith mediator on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Good question. And I wish I could give a clear answer to that, because exactly where the Chinese stand, there are different views on that. I noted that when China presented 12 points, it wasn't a peace plan, but it was 12 points, I said. The first of those points, and allegedly the most important one, was a rather good one, in my opinion, because they said that they supported firmly the independence of radiating territorial integrity of every nation. I mean, they didn't mention Ukraine specifically, but it was a paper about the conflict. And that particular first point was distinctly on the Ukrainian side and was distinctly against the Russians on the very core of the conflict, because the core of the conflict is the territorial integrity. Have they followed up on that? We don't really know what Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin. We noticed that the final communique, they mentioned very clearly sort of support for the principles of the UN Charter and international law, which can be said to be a reference to the first point. Then there are other points, ceasefires and no sanctions and whatever. But of course, everything hangs on the first point. So I've been saying, contrast to, I saw that sort of President Biden came out and said this is nothing coming out of China. I've been somewhat more open and said, look at the first point. I mean, they're actually coming down firmly on the Ukraine side, in spite of the fact that they have, no question about that, what we could call an anti-American alliance between Beijing and Moscow. It has been said that the Chinese were going to reach out and take some contact with Kiev after the visit to Moscow. I haven't seen that yet, and I think that will be very important to see if that happens. I don't expect them to mediate peace, but it's fairly obvious that they are somewhat uncomfortable with what Mr. Putin is up to, and they've been particularly comfortable with his rattling nuclear weapons, and have made strong statements to that effect that nuclear wars, forget about it, don't talk about it, which hasn't prevented Mr. Putin from doing exactly that, by the way.
So another question about the war in Ukraine. Recently, there has been a quiet assertion in the media that a combination of Ukrainian and American actors may have been responsible for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline destruction/incident. How might the revelation of the responsible actors for the pipeline's destruction impact Europe's posture towards the war?
I don't think it's impacted at all. I mean, we don't know, quite frankly. There's different theories circulating around. I mean, there was an American journalist who published a lengthy piece and saying it was done by the Americans and the Norwegians, of all people. But the factual errors in that particular story were so massive that I think it lost credibility. There have been those who believe the Russians did it for one reason or another, and clearly the Ukrainians could have a motive, but did the Ukrainians really have the ability to do it? Because it's a fairly complicated thing at a very considerable distance from any sort of naval and seaborne assets that Ukraine might have. We simply don't know. I guess at some point in time we will find out, but we are not there yet.
Another question about the war. If and when Putin places nukes in Belarus, what do you think NATO's next steps would be? Do you believe the threat of nuclear war is likely at this time?
I don't think so at this time. You can't exclude it. If Mr. Putin would to be in a situation where he's absolutely desperate and about to lose everything, I mean, he could be a very desperate man in a certain situation. We are not there now. So for the moment, I don't see that danger as particularly high. He has now decided to build a storage facility for nuclear weapons in Belarus. What is the logic behind that? I don't know. It's probably to try to scare people. In substance, it doesn't make a difference whatsoever. Where the sort of storage facilities for tactical nuclear weapons are, I mean, they're already in Kaliningrad, by the way. And if he has another facility in Belarus, from the sort of military political point of view, it makes no difference whatsoever. From the political point of view, yeah, he wants to send a signal of some sort. I think it's going to cause some disquiet in Belarus because they have been sort of proud of their non-nuclear status up until now. Of course, it's going to be Russian nuclear weapons, not Belarusian nuclear weapons. But anyhow, so one of these political moves that he is making without much substantive importance, I would say.
If I could just add a point there, Carl. I think what I've said all along about the nuclear weapons in this war is that it's not what the Russians say. It's the fact that, in fact, the more they talk about them, the more I think they're trying to beef up the value of what they already have. They have the nuclear weapons. They're close by. They have the doctrine. They train. So, we should be worried about them, not because of what they say, but because of their existence. And the more they talk about it, in fact, the more I think they're realizing they're not getting deterrent value out of the existing nuclear weapons, so they try to add to that by all of this saber rattling. But I think we do have to take into account the fact that they exist. I've been in conferences with people, mostly Americans, who say, well, we're allowing ourselves to be self-deterred by, there's no reason to worry. I think, they're there. We have to worry about them.
No, they are there, but I don't think we have a situation in the conflict as of the present where there is any immediate danger of them being used. There could be, as I said, situations where Mr. Putin feels that he's in an extreme situation and might contemplate to use them. If he does, I think it would be fairly catastrophic for him, I have to say. It would be a huge bang somewhere. But yeah. I think no doubt about that. But the political effect is likely to be very strongly against Russia on the global level as well as on the European and other levels. What's going to be the reaction in Russia? I don't know. But I fail to see that if he were to do it, it would serve his aim.
Yeah, I agree with that. For that reason, I think they are deterred, not only by what we might do, but by the global consequences of using nuclear weapons. And as the technical side of me always wants to point out, the wind blows in the wrong direction for the Russians.
Not a good thing. And the Chinese have been very vocal on this particular issue. And if there's one friend in the world, or semi-friend, that he must take to some extent into consideration, it is China.
Thank you both. So switching gears a little bit, we had several questions come in about NATO, and you answered a few of them already about Turkey and Sweden. So this audience member asked, looking back on the pace and process of NATO expansion in the 1990s, is there anything you wish were done differently?
Not really. I mean, I always point out that it wasn't on the surface of it, you could say it was NATO expanding towards the east. But for those of us who were in the middle of the process, it was rather the other way around. It was these countries wanted to go west. There was a situation that, for all sorts of historical reasons that are fairly obvious, when these nations, we conquered their independence. be that formally the three Baltic states, or be that de jure the Baltic states, or be that formally, say, Poland and others. I mean, they clearly wanted some sort of security, and they wanted that in the West. That is NATO, and that was the European Union. Same thing. They were knocking on the doors and say, we want to go West. And it was very difficult to, I mean, there were some people say we shouldn't. But it was very difficult to say no to them. And we shouldn't either. Because I argued at the time, by the way, with the Baltic states, for example, that it's only by giving them that security that they will be able to develop fairly normal relationship with Russia. Otherwise, they would have been so nervous about the relationship with Russia all the time that there would not have been room for the normalization of that particular relationship. The same applied to Poland, by the way, which is a fairly significant country. So I think it was entirely correct. There was some uneasiness in Russia, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, the Russians said, okay, as long as we have certain principles. I mean, that it was said, for example, that NATO should not deploy any major combat formations in the new member states. And that was adhered to. I mean, there was virtually nothing there up until 2014. I remember in 2013, where the US withdrew its last combat tank from the continent of Europe. Everything was drawn down. There was nothing. It was only in 2014 when the Russians went into Ukraine for the first time and took over Crimea, that some limited NATO units were deployed, more symbolic at that time in the three Baltic states. So NATO adhered to what it had promised the Russians at that time. They did not adhere to what they had promised in terms of respecting the territorial integrity of Ukraine, needless to say.
Right. So switching gears again to a bit of your other experience, this audience member asked, it is tempting for Americans to think that the tensions in the Balkans are all in the past. What is the likelihood that those tensions will flare up again, and what could be the cause?
I don't think they will flare up in terms of a war of the sort that we saw in the 1990s. I think those days are gone. And I think one of the things that you can learn from wars is that those who have seen wars are not very keen to get back into war. So I normally say that since the end of the war in Bosnia, we've had more people killed by violence in the suburbs of Stockholm than we had in Bosnia. We haven't had anyone really during this entire period. Does that mean that it's all peace, love, and happiness? No, it's not. I mean, some of the fundamental contradictions are still there. And there have been intense negotiations just the last few weeks at a new agreement between Serbia and Kosovo. EU very active with good support from Washington, trying to broker agreements. We have still issues in North Macedonia that needs to be sorted out. We have an EU accession process that is going very slowly. So the Balkans require quite a lot of diplomatic effort still to move it forward. I mean, there is the risk of a flare-up of some sort in perhaps in sort of northern Kosovo. I don't see it at the moment, but the risk is there. But we are talking about local issues. We are not talking about war. That danger is gone.
What are your thoughts on the recent developments in the Republic of Georgia regarding the foreign agents law and potential Kremlin influence within the ruling government? Is there still a clear path to a future with the European Union and as a liberal democracy?
I wouldn't say that there's a particular clear path, because I mean the Georgian government, which is a strange one, because we have the formal government and then we have sort of the oligarch Mr. Ivanishvili, who's sitting in his sort of residence up in the mountains, taking all of the decisions. And the foreign agent law was a step too far. They had to go back after significant protest. They keep the former president Mikhail Saakashvili in prison. Unjustifiable. They've charged him with a couple of things that are fairly minor, as a matter of fact. I mean, even if you were to believe them, they're fairly minor. So there are quite a number of question marks on the sort of democratic credibility of the present Georgian government. So I think they will have some difficulties going forward on their European path. long term or medium term, perhaps even short term, I hope that these things will change and we will be able to welcome Georgia as well.
Turning back to the war in Ukraine for our last few questions. The first one is, will Russia's war with Ukraine be a Hamiltonian moment for the EU? Is the project of the Federal European Union closer to implementation today or further?
Well, I mean, to some extent, we could say it's a Hamiltonian movement, but not necessarily in us going federal in every single respect. No. EU is already a federation when it comes to trade policy, single market. As a matter of fact, it's more integrated in those issues than the United States. We learned a lesson when we were negotiating for something called the TTIP agreement a couple of years ago, and we learned that we had more regulatory unification in Europe that you had between the states of the United States. So we have quite a number of issues where it is a federal entity, decisions, power is in Brussels, trade policy, common market notably. What with not foreign and security affairs, that's intergovernmental. But what we've seen here is, of course, that the states have been able or willing to take very far-reaching decisions together to build up structures also for European security and defense. And we've also built up after the financial crisis and the euro crisis and the Greek crisis, fairly significant common instruments when it comes to managing financial issues and financial stability issues. It's a gradual movement that is happening. I'm quite certain that new competences will be added, particularly in the area of foreign and security policy as a result of this crisis.
Anna Maria Bildt, what's sample here?
Another question, the Chinese have significant agricultural holdings in northern Ukraine. Is there a possibility that the Russo-Chinese alliance is partially based upon maintaining the supply chain of these commodities to China?
I don't think so. It is true that sort of there was a good economic relationship between China and Ukraine. Also when it comes to, as a matter of fact, sort of defense goods. I mean, Ukraine did have, that was remnants from the Soviet days, but it did have a fairly good defense industry that was supplying also with some high-tech stuff China. And there was also exports, as you say, of food commodities. But I don't think that plays any role in this particular conflict.
We might go back to I want to just go back to your comment about the countries from the former Soviet and Warsaw Pact wanting to move west as opposed to NATO moving east, because I think that's exactly right. We ran for several reasons, some accidental reasons, had 3 different conferences in Eastern Europe in 1990, one in Hungary, one in Poland, and then 1 year later in Czechoslovakia. And these were ostensibly conferences to talk about how do armed forces operate in democratic states. But what happened was that the people from those 3 countries right then said immediately, we want to be part of NATO. And I mean, it just kind of shocked a lot of Americans because it never crossed their mind that we would be expanding NATO to the east, but they wanted it. It was their point. And I think it was, and I kept saying to people, what should be our answer? Have a nice day. I mean, they're going to join NATO. It's what's going to happen. And that's, of course, what did happen.
And Rand did play a role. I think Ron Asmus, who was a key man in the State Department and later wrote the book, I think he wrote that particular book when he was at Rand, if I remember things rightly. So
that's correct. Yeah,
Rand has an honorable part of that particular history.
Yeah, I didn't want to mention that, but you can. Okay.
So for our final question, this audience member would like to hear your thoughts on where things will go with Ukraine looking forward. How might it realistically end?
I think the conflict, let's go to the origin of the conflict. The origin of the conflict is really that Mr. Putin wants to get rid of Ukraine, to put it very bluntly, and he's been fairly explicit of that. he wants to build sort of a greater Russian, greater Slav empire, Tsarist model. And there's no place for an independent Ukraine or an independent Belarus, for that sake, in that particular vision of his. He's tied himself very, very clearly to that vision. And I don't see him backing down from it. I think the conflict, the one way or the other, will be there as long as he's in the Kremlin. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be open war every single day of that period. There might be a period where there's a pause or something like that, or some temporary arrangement. But as long as Mr. Putin is in the Kremlin, we should harbor no illusions whatsoever that the basic conflict is going to be there. Our task is then to secure Ukraine. We do that by military and financial support short term. Now that's necessary. But I think necessary will be to have them as members of the European Union. That's not an easy thing. It will not happen easily. There will be substantial issues that will have to be tackled in that particular process. But I would say that we won't get anything. We might have an end of the open conflict, but we will not have anything resembling peace in the east of Europe until Mr. Putin is gone and until Ukraine is secured as a member of the European Union. And this is not going to happen by next week, if I express myself clearly.
Well, thank you both so much again for joining us. And Jim, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks again to you, Rachel, and your staff, the staff of the World Affairs Council, for all you do to make it possible to put these events together. It makes it very easy. Well, thanks, Carl, very much for staying up late. Or maybe for you it's early, but it's late.
It's okay. A pleasure.
Yeah, well, it's been great to have you here virtually in Los Angeles, or in Santa Monica, which is where I'm sitting. I think we had a great conversation here. I mean, I think I had a few more questions, but we're not going to extend this any further. So we just want to say thank you, and I'll turn it back to Kim.
Thank you.
Well, you both were rock stars. This was so informative, so timely, so much information that many of us are not reading in depth in the top level media. So thank you so much for those inside baseball comments. They're very helpful. Prime Minister Bildt, if you're ever coming back through or to Los Angeles, we would just be thrilled to host you as an in-person speaker, because I think there's so many questions I can see in the Q&A that they would love to have this longer and more involved. And Jim, we are so appreciative of you as a board member of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council Town Hall. With your experience as the CEO of RAND previously, all of this experience is so helpful to all of us to learn and to better understand. So thank you so much, both of you.